Welcome to Talking with Tatchell. Gordon Brown is refusing to meet the Zimbabwean dictator, Robert Mugabe. He says he wants to take a stand against tyranny. But Gordon Brown is prepared to meet the Saudi dictator, King Abdullah. In fact, next week he's going to be inviting King Abdullah to Downing Street, and the Queen will be hosting King Abdullah at Buckingham Palace. This is despite the fact that King Abdullah's regime stands accused of detention without trial, torture, and public beheadings. His regime bans political parties, bans trade unions, bans religious organisations who are not according to his particular interpretation of Islam. It is an extremely despotic, tyrannical regime, yet we, the British government rather, sells King Abdullah arms and we buy his oil. In effect, we, British people, are helping prop up his regime. With me to discuss the Saudi despotism and the protests next week against King Abdullah's visit are Owen Jones of the Socialist Youth Network and Simon Hill of the Campaign Against the Arms Trade. Welcome to you both. Owen, I wonder if you could just start by giving us a sense of the scale of human rights abuses in Saudi Arabia. Just take a look at the issue of executions, for example. What's the picture there?
Okay, well, Saudi Arabia is responsible for one of the highest rates of executions in the world in terms of absolute numbers and on a per capita basis. According to the most conservative estimates we have, because obviously it's very hard to get reports from within the kingdom because of the extent of the repression, but according to the reports Amnesty International has received, at least 1,500 people have been killed in the past 2 decades. Now, to look at in terms of executions, these aren't simply for what we'd regard as criminal offences, but also for obviously non-violent offences, whether that be witchcraft, for example, in inverted quotes, or apostasy. It's for or other offences such as drug trafficking. Now, the problem, obviously, is these people are often detained without even being detained, literally snatched from their homes or their offices or their workplaces without any explanation. They're then thrown into a cell without even being told what they're being charged with. They have no access to a lawyer, no access to the outside world. And then, after an arbitrary sentencing, they're then confined to a cell. Executions always happen every Friday. They're never even told in advance when they're to be executed. So you can only imagine over the period of weeks and months these people languishing in cells waiting for their execution. Often their families are told before they're executed that they've already been killed. They're then, one Friday morning, the first they ever hear about it is they're taken out of their cell, handcuffed, taken out to be executed. And with these executions, they're usually public beheadings. Sometimes with women, they're shot, but generally we're talking public beheadings. And these are extremely gruesome events. For example, it doesn't often take just one cut to behead someone. It can take a while, and obviously these are done publicly, and therefore ensuring that this is the most horrific experience possible for the person who's facing this awful execution. So really, it is a public execution by a very brutal, savage means, but also calculated to strike fear and terror into the population. Well, that's exactly it. I mean, effectively, it's a form of state terrorism. It's a way of ensuring not only, obviously, that these individuals are killed in the most barbaric fashion, by doing it in that public way, in this medieval fashion, we in the West might think of it, I suppose, that this strikes fear in the hearts of others so that they will not speak out against the government, for example, or criticise its policies in the way that some of these dissidents who are being executed have done or have been accused of doing. I mean, Simon, can you get some sense of the kind, give us some sense of the kind of human rights abuses that are happening, other abuses?
Well, as you said, Peter, there's suppression of all political and religious dissent. The laws about religious liberty in Saudi Arabia would be oppressive enough if they were enforced, but the oppression actually goes beyond what's stated in the law. So For example, the law guarantees non-Muslims the right to worship as long as they don't seek to promote their religion to Muslims. In practice, Christian meetings are routinely broken up by the authorities.
This is even Christian meetings in people's private houses.
In people's houses. In people's houses.
They're not proselytising,
no,
just privately worshipping.
Privately worshipping in their houses, routinely broken up. The largest religious minority, the Shia Muslims, face severe persecution as well as routine discrimination in terms of employment and housing. And even within the Sunni Muslim community, as you said, any interpretation of Sunni Islam that differs from the official line is immediately stamped on and suppressed.
And I can remember a friend of mine who briefly worked on a contract in Saudi Arabia and telling me how that Filipino Catholics who were working with him, one Sunday they had a private little prayer meeting in their home and they were all raided, carted off,
Absolutely.
subjected to torture. Quite shocking things. This was no threat to the Saudi religious establishment.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And of course it doesn't, as you say, a few Catholics meeting in a private house doesn't threaten the Saudi establishment. But if people feel they can't even practice their own religion or express their own political or ethical views, then it goes towards, as you say, striking terror into people. So there's just constant daily fear in the population.
What about the rights of women? I mean, we hear a lot about that women can't vote in Saudi Arabia.
Well, I mean, it's a form effectively of gender apartheid which exists in Saudi Arabia. For example, if you look at the number of women who can work, it's the lowest proportion of the workforce in the world. Only 5% of women in Saudi Arabia work, and it's in the most menial labour. Women are banned, forbidden from driving. Women can only leave the country with the written permission of a male relative. Obviously, you also have the enforcement of the strict moral code by the Mutawwin, which is the religious police, which are effectively a law unto their own. And they will go throughout the kingdom. Often, they'll find women who they don't believe are properly veiled, and often detain them and often beat them very brutally. There was a famous case a few years ago of a religious school which burned down, and the women were attempting to flee, and because many of them weren't properly veiled, the Mutawwin arrived and ensured that they went back into the burning building, and 15 of those women actually perished. And this just shows the extent of the situation which is facing ordinary Saudi women.
Effectively, from the point of or the time of menstruation onwards, women have to dress head to toe in these totally enveloping cloth prisons, which makes it impossible to do many tasks. So it is really both a repressive regime in denying women's right to vote, but also psychologically and emotionally very oppressive in that women themselves feel imprisoned by a dress code which does not apply to men, it only applies to women. And quite clearly it's designed to reiterate their second-class legal status. Well,
exactly, and of course many of us are fully aware of the situation under the Taliban in Afghanistan, that those policies were actually exported by the Wahhabi practitioners in the establishment of Saudi Arabia to Afghanistan. This is where it actually originated, and it has nothing to do with Islam. In the Quran it says that women should dress modestly, as it does in pretty much all religions. Which is obviously open to varying different any interpretation. It has nothing to do with imprisoning women within the sort of clothing which they're forced to, effectively walking tents, they've been described, which is obviously ensures that women face the most degrading and difficult existences imaginable.
Simon, can you give us a couple more examples? Yeah.
On that very point about women in Saudi Arabia and the Taliban-style interpretation of Islam, I remember when Tony Blair was declaring his support for the bombing of Afghanistan, and he said one of the reasons for tackling the Taliban was because of the treatment of women in Afghanistan. At the very same time as he was endorsing that, he was defending the sale of arms by BAE Systems to Saudi Arabia, a system, a country in which women are treated, as you say, pretty much as they were under the Taliban.
Can you give us some more examples of human rights abuses in Saudi?
Well, I mean, we talk about women not being allowed to vote. The reality is there's very little voting going on at all in Saudi Arabia. What voting there is local elections. There are no
very tightly controlled about who can stand, which parties can be formed.
And there's no national elections. There's no political parties, no legal political parties. There's effectively no organisations permitted that are not endorsed by the state, and as I say, discrimination against religious minorities, against women, also against gay, lesbian, and bisexual people. It really is hard to imagine a more brutal regime than Saudi Arabia.
In terms of workers' rights, trade unions are banned.
That's right. There's no right at all to form any independent labour organisation. And in fact, there's an exiled Saudi trade unionist who'll be at the protest next week, and I'll talk about that later on. But the stories which he's spoken about, which is, I mean, they have these labour courts which exist, which are effectively state tools. There's no real way of redressing basic workers' grievances. The ones who suffer the most are migrant workers. They form about 25% of the Saudi population.
Mostly like Philippines, Sri Lanka.
And there's a pecking order. Those who come from the poorest countries, such as the Philippines, for example, are those that are treated the worst. Those from the West are obviously effectively an aristocracy there in terms of the workforce. But those from the poorest countries often, extremely low wages, exploited ruthlessly, do very menial jobs.
Often have to work 10, 12, 16 hours a day.
That's right, so with no breaks. And there's no, as you say, there's no right whatsoever to form any trade unions, which are ruthlessly suppressed by the Saudi state.
No legal protections against abuse.
None at all, no.
Health and safety regulations are almost non-existent.
Well, exactly. And there's huge cases of, obviously, very workers who are dying in very unsafe conditions in Saudi Arabia. And this exists whilst you get this exploited huge workforce, whilst the princes are enjoying the huge amounts of oil wealth and effectively pillaging the natural resources with the support of the West in Saudi Arabia, whilst the vast majority, millions of migrant workers and Saudi workers languish in poverty with no right to actually defend their rights.
And what about the situation? You mentioned gay and lesbian people. I mean, under Saudi law, same-sex relations are illegal and are punishable by death.
Yes, absolutely.
And that law is enforced, and recently I think 2 men were sentenced to 7,000 lashes for same-sex relations. And although that's not a death sentence, in theory,
effect it is.
In effect it could well be, because, depends how many lashes are administered at any one time, that could be sufficient to send the body into shock and to cause those people to die.
Absolutely. And as Owen said, there's... it's very difficult to get all the detailed information on the executions, but these just so many examples.
Well, in terms of the LGBT community, I mean, for example, those lashings which are administered is obviously one of the main forms of torture which are used. And just recently, obviously, you attended a protest outside the Saudi embassy, highlighting a recent example where these Saudi gay men were administered, sentenced to these lashings. Often they take place over a number of weeks. So it will be day after day repeated lashings, which is an extreme form of torture, and as you say, often results in death, although we're not sure of the extent of that for obvious reasons.
Yeah. I mean, the key thing is that the Saudi state is shrouded in secrecy. There's no transparency, so the actual number of people executed, as you said, Amnesty is talking about maybe 1,100, 1,200, maybe 1,500 over a 20-year period, but that's just the cases that we know of.
Well, exactly.
And in terms of political prisoners, we know there are many political prisoners, but the precise number is unknown because there are no open trials, there's no open transparency and right of people to have lawyers and have proper defence. The media can't report these cases because it's all subject to state censorship. So we're talking about a regime that really is not open to scrutiny by Saudis, let alone by the international community.
Well, this is the key point, really, I think, and one of the main reasons these protests have been organised is the double standards of the West. I mean, there's a conspiracy of silence about the human rights record in Saudi Arabia. The West obviously continues to bankroll this regime. It sends it weapons, as Simon will no doubt go into detail about. We obviously buy its oil. We have a situation where the West often uses the issue of human rights selectively when it's attempting maybe to justify going to war against a country and itself, obviously, for example, in Iraq, going to war using those human rights abuses, and then itself obviously using that as a pretext to start a war which has resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. Just recently, as you said earlier on, Gordon Brown, for example, criticised the Burmese dictatorship for its severe repression of the Burmese people recently, and that, of course, is to be welcome. We can all oppose the human rights situation there. But Saudi Arabia is no less repressive or autocratic than Burma, and yet Western leaders refuse to speak out. And it's no surprise, for example, in the US regime refuses to speak out against the situation in Saudi Arabia because there's almost a symbiotic relationship between the Bush dynasty and the Saudi dynasty. There's business links going back decades, long before even Bush Senior was in power. So we have a situation where this is a regime propped up and actually very closely linked to many to the government here in Britain and also in the US. It's a government which the Saudi regime enjoys the protection of the West, and it can act with impunity in the knowledge that it will never face the actions which the West has taken elsewhere.
Mm. Do you want to talk, Simon, about the arms deals that Britain's involved in, and perhaps then after that we'll move on to the corruption issue?
Yeah, sure. There's been, going back decades, arms deals between BAE Systems, which is the largest UK-based arms company, although it's a multinational company, effectively, and the Saudi government. And recently, the Saudis agreed to buy 72 Eurofighter aircraft at a cost of some billions of pounds, the precise amount isn't known, from BAE. There's other British companies that sell there. There's a few years ago, there were British people who found themselves in Saudi prisons, restrained by chains that had "Made in Britain" stamped on them. But on a large scale, we're talking the equipment that BAE sells worth billions. And just to be clear, this is not a sale that is bringing benefits to the British economy. BAE like to talk about British jobs that depend on it, as if millionaire arms dealers trading with tyrants are motivated by working people's livelihoods. The reality is that the numbers that BAE have given for how many jobs come from this deal vary enormously. Their apologists in the media vary the numbers. So, sometimes it'll be 5,000, sometimes it'll be 100,000. I mean, we're talking about that sort of variance in an attempt to justify it. And of course, the reality is that a lot of the jobs from the deal were based in Saudi Arabia or elsewhere, because BAE, for all their talk, they're a multinational company. They're about profit. They're not about Britain and about jobs.
Mm. And what about the corruption angle, the kickbacks and the huge bribes that were paid out to a Saudi prince, allegedly?
Well, BAE's been accused for years of corruption, of running a multi-million-pound slush fund to bribe Saudi princes with expensive hotels and cars and prostitutes, and paying money into Swiss bank accounts. It was alleged, just to get some idea of the scale of this, or the sort of absurdity of it, it was alleged they bribed a Saudi prince by giving him a private plane painted in the colours of his favourite sports team, as a sort of bit of an extra thing in addition to the Swiss bank accounts. You can't really quite get your head around that scale of corruption. Now, BAE say they're innocent. I'm not saying they're guilty. What I'm saying is they should be investigated for those allegations. And they were being investigated by the Serious Fraud Office. Last autumn, it was reported that the Serious Fraud Office had got access to Swiss bank accounts and that charges were imminent. The Saudi regime and BAE flew into alarm. There was huge amounts of pressure in the media and in Parliament and in Downing Street and in the MOD exerted by BAE and by the Saudis. BAE's supportive columnists in the right-wing media started vastly inflating the number of jobs that depended on it. And then on the 14th of December, Tony Blair's government, and the next day Tony Blair himself, declared that the the inquiry was being dropped, supposedly because it was threatening relations with Saudi Arabia.
This was direct political interference in the process of a legal investigation.
Absolutely, that's exactly what it was. It is political interference in a criminal investigation.
By the Prime Minister, by a Labour Prime Minister.
The day after, it was Goldsmith, the Attorney General, announced the decision, and the day after Tony Blair said he took full responsibility for it. It's worth, and some people say, oh, well, he had to do it because of the jobs, which, as I say, a very small number of jobs. You can't see Tony Blair interfering in investigation to save that number of jobs in car manufacturing or in the post office or whatever. But the reality is that Robin Cook, the former Foreign Secretary, said that under Tony Blair, BAE's boss had the key to the garden door at number 10. And he never saw Tony Blair take any decision that BAE didn't like. And that's perhaps the ultimate example that he was willing to interfere in a criminal investigation if it threatened BAE. And of all things to claim in his defence, that it was threatening relations with Saudi Arabia, which he said were essential for the war on terror. It's difficult to have an ally in the war on terror that is itself a terrorist government. I mean, Owen's described some of the terror that King Abdullah inflicts on his own people. To say we need his support for a war on terror is just it would be funny if it wasn't so indeed. So
do you want to add a bit about this whole issue, Owen?
Well, I mean, I think it gets to the very heart of it, really. It's the double standards of the West, where it will, for example, condemn Saddam Hussein's regime as an exporter of terror, in terms of enforcing terror against its own people and allegedly exporting it elsewhere, although obviously those claims have since been disproven. Saudi Arabia is a state which is obviously armed to the teeth by the West. It receives huge amounts of military aid. And interesting, because obviously Israel is one of the other beneficiaries of Western military aid, and it came out publicly to defend Saudi Arabia and that arms deal on the basis Saudi Arabia was a moderate country. Now, not sure what, stretching the definition of moderate, certainly in my opinion, and I think for most people, this is a country which, as we've already explained, it's public beheadings, torture, bans all political parties, one of the most repressive regimes in the world. And also, as has been revealed since, and is extensively investigated, is one of the centres of international terrorism, which the West claims, supposedly, to be against. And I think that just gets to the crux of the issue, that the West strikes at a regime, no matter how brutal Saddam Hussein's regime had nothing to do with international terrorism, while Saudi Arabia, the very centre of those forms of international terrorism, continues to enjoy the active support and patronage of the West.
Yeah, it does, I think, strike anyone who knows anything about the Saudi situation, just unbelievable hypocrisy that, this extremely brutal, extremely tyrannical regime, which is implicated in the export of terrorism around the world, does enjoy such favoured nation status with Britain and the United States. Our government keeps on talking about having to tackle Islamist fundamentalism. Well, the main source of Islamist fundamentalism in the world, or one of the main sources, is Saudi Arabia.
Indeed, and one of the particularly hypocritical things, I think, is the way the government talks about supporting moderate Muslims and liberal Muslim opinion. Liberal Muslims in Saudi Arabia, or indeed, any Muslims who differ from the state line, don't get the support of the British government. They get the British government turning a blind eye as they're imprisoned and tortured for deviating from the government's position. And I suggest it is precisely because of the arms trade and the oil trade that successive British governments, Thatcher, Major, Blair, and now Brown, have been prepared to turn a blind eye to what's going on in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, they're putting oil and arms sales before human rights.
Before human rights.
Well, that's the message the West is basically
Yeah.
conveying to the world, that if you continue to buy our weapons and continue to allow us to buy your oil, then you have carte blanche. You can behave as you will. And also, if you act in your foreign policy in a way that is supportive of Western interests, then you are immune from criticism. I think one of the most repulsive examples of the British government's support for the Saudi regime happened a few years ago. Sandy Mitchell, who will be speaking at the protest next week, was a Briton who was imprisoned along with several other Britons in Saudi Arabia for 2 years for allegedly the alleged murder of someone else, and the Saudi authorities argued this was to do with drug turf wars between expats, when it was obviously very clear that it was to do with the internal rising terrorist problem within Saudi Arabia, which the Saudi authorities are obviously very keen to hide. Now, Sandy Mitchell was, along with these others, was beaten repeatedly for 2 years, told he was going to be beheaded publicly, obviously had no right to a fair trial whatsoever, had the most extremely horrific experience, which we can't imagine. When they finally were released and came back to Britain, they then attempted to get redress through the courts against the Saudi government, and to have their convictions overturned. And the British government actually intervened to support the Saudi government's claims within the courts. It was an example of this government allying itself, supporting the accusations of a illegitimate dictatorship, its ally, against its own people.
Mm. Tell us a little bit about next Wednesday's protest. Wednesday the 31st of October, there's going to be a protest outside the Saudi embassy in the evening from 6 to 8 p.m. to demand what?
Well, it's got a number of three main issues. Firstly, it's to break the conspiracy of silence about the Saudi human rights situation. It's a human rights catastrophe. For far too long, it's been ignored. And obviously, as I've said, the main reason for that is Western support because of its economic and strategic interest in Saudi Arabia. So it's to expose that human rights situation, put it firmly on the top of the political agenda as far as we can do that. Secondly, it's to obviously give King Abdullah the welcome that I think he properly deserves. Abdullah al-Saud is one of the world's worst tyrants, and yet, unfortunately, because of the lack of knowledge about the Saudi situation, because of the willful suppression of that, very little is known about. And also, it's to stand in solidarity with the Saudi people at their time of need.
Well, thank you both very much, and I hope that those of you who are watching will turn out next Wednesday, the 31st of October, from 6 to 8 p.m. outside the Saudi Embassy, number 30 Charles Street, London W1, to show the Saudi king, the killer king, that he's not welcome in Britain and that we stand against him and his tyrannical regime in support of the people of Saudi Arabia in their struggle for democracy, human rights and social justice. Please join me next week for another edition of Talking with Tatchell.